now it is time for a double act with Katie and Tim. And they're going to be updating us on the work of the different groups, how Amex fed into that as well, and the march towards these social media measurement standards. So please welcome Katie Payne and Tim Marclane.
Thank you, Richard. And actually, I think the last question is a good bridge to this discussion. So hopefully, as we go through it, we'll be able to elaborate on what Philip played out. So just jumping forward, I think we've got my title and Katie's title, which you know. But I think as we get into, if you jump a couple slides ahead, or I probably.
Am I doing this? Okay.
Do so. Yeah, give it to Tim.
So the need for standards, I mean, we've talked a lot about it here, so this probably doesn't need tremendous elaboration, but I think as we look at the maturity cycle of social media, we've really moved well past the experimentation phase where it was okay and probably encouraged to just dive in and figure it out. Now clients are really looking for more robust metrics, and they need to, if they've already made the investment, they need to justify that or maintain the investment. But they're probably also looking for ways to figure out, well, how much should we be investing? And in some cases, how can they expand it? Clearly, the marketplace is demanding standards. We've got clients, agencies, and research firms that need some common language. Trying to unify perspective and metrics across communications disciplines is really critical. Social media is not owned by one discipline. It can't be managed purely by one discipline. It has to be a cross-discipline thing, similar to what Philip was talking about with influence. So we need standardized approaches and standardized metrics that would be applied uniquely to the individual client's situation. And I think, a big part of what we're all talking about here is accelerating a shift from essentially low-level counting to higher-level value metrics that can start to get to the business discussions that the Booz Allen team was talking about yesterday. We included just a few examples, and I think these are actually quotes that David Geddes had pulled from various RFPs or client conversations about what clients are looking at, and basically they are looking for guidance on standards. I've been part of, and I think Katie's been part of, several client sessions where they've brought in different agencies to help them develop the standards for their organization, and I can say in almost every case they would rather take standardized approaches that have been developed by the industry to adopt them, but some of the leading edge companies are pushing it faster than the industry has. So I think we've got a little bit of a give and take here in terms of how things can move quickly. But I think this quote from the automotive company is really important, that the more that we essentially fight over numbers or fight over approaches, the more that we distract clients and the more that we're not able to actually move to something that's incredibly meaningful. So I think this quote you all saw in the program, so credit goes to Barry in coming up with this quote, but I think it's a good unifying mantra for us as we go through this journey. I don't know, Katie, do you want to talk about some of what we've got in terms of what is a standard and some of our thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that the approach to standards is really that it's like influence and engagement. It's a way overused term that not everybody understands. Standards, in my world, when people say we need a standard, they frequently do not even know what a standard is. David Michelson and Don Stacks and some people at the Institute for Public Relations have done a fair amount of work and written a wonderful paper about what a standard really is. And it is a common specification but the first thing is it establishes a common language. So when somebody says to me, we need a standard, half the people think, well, we need something like a GRP or a impression count. And this is really what they're talking about. And the reality is that's not really what we're talking about. So it's a common language. It contains some technical specifications, and it's consistency. It's used consistently across the industry. And so what we're trying to get to with this standard approach is something that the clients are asking for, which is, tell me what you mean by this, right? So when I say engagement, or I say influence, or I say, here are your results, what does that mean? What does a placement mean? What does a hit mean? All those other things. So that's where we're getting to.
There's been a lot of great work over the past few years that we can build upon. So some of you may remember Barcelona Principle number 6, though probably most of you remember one of the other ones that was all about AVE. But we did lay out some preliminary guidelines here in Barcelona about social media measurement that were expanded through the AMEC task force work that some of us were involved in building into. Actually, I think it was London, November 2010. Yeah, well, November 2010, and then we had the Big Ask conference last year. So this is all prior work that we're building on. I don't think anything that we've done really negates that. I think what is different now is that we've got a foundation for not only an industry collaboration approach, but a cross-industry collaboration approach. So I'll talk about the coalition in a minute, because there's essentially, we started, I would say actually it was last summer. Was it this conference? Or no, it was in Philadelphia.
It was in Lisbon.
Where we committed to the Institute for Public Relations, AMEC, and the Council for PR Firms to creating the Social Media Measurement Standards Coalition, which has now been expanded to a broader coalition that I'll talk about in a second. And in parallel with that, I think Katie made the smart and bold move to say we need to start talking with other organizations and other associations. So Katie, do you want to talk about the conclave and the idea behind that?
Yeah, this is not a religious organization. As I said, the fact that we call ourselves the Measurati is not having there's no religious connotations here. When I actually said it in Lisbon last summer, and then sort of set about to make happen, was I'm very aware and very involved with the, what was at the time, the Web Analytics Association. Is now the Digital Analytics Association, which are the people who set standards for how you count clicks and things like that. Also very aware that our clients are paying a lot of attention to the Interactive Advertising Bureau, the 4As, all these other groups. And I said, okay, I'm going to put them all in a living room and not let them out until they agree. And with enough wine and lobsters, it actually happened. So what we started last October was this merging together of industry groups around this need for standards. And literally, at the time, it was thrilling as hell to me that we got every member of the coalition, plus IABC, the International Association of Business Communicators, as well as the Word of Mouth Marketing Association and the, what was the time, Web Analytics Association, in a room together. As well as, and all of these standards are meaningless unless you have client participation. And we had Procter & Gamble there, and we had SAS, and we had Thomson Reuters. And we had the agreement to participate from Southwest Airlines and Dell at the time. After that, word got out, we were doing this stuff, and the Media Ratings Council called me up and said, hey, we understand you're doing the social media thing, so are we. Let's all get together. Well, the Media Ratings Council is actually the organization which in the 50s established standards for measurement of television and is chartered by the U.S. Congress. And since the 1950s, it's been setting standards. It knows way more about setting standards than anybody in this room. It's an amazing organization. And they've been contracted by IAB and WOMA, and their clients include pretty much everybody on the planet that's paying for anything in social media. So they're participating. We have now we have Ford, as well as I think maybe even GM. We have a bunch of clients participating, and essentially what I'm finding with all of these groups is the fact that they're so hungry for anything that we give them that basically they say, okay. So to a certain extent, what we are doing now is setting standards for a far broader industry than just just PR measurement. Or just even what we consider social media measurement. So it's a very exciting moment in time. Everybody's looking to essentially this broader conclave of people to do things, and we have a very clear agenda of where we're starting from, which is today with the content, but we're going down the road, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, and I think that the spirit of collaboration has been very much in such a way where you don't know necessarily where the boundaries begin and end across the organizations or between the coalition and the conclave. It really has been kind of a joint effort throughout, and I think what's been great about it is bringing together the perspectives of different industry disciplines has changed, in some cases brought commonality, but in other cases it's kind of added to layers that we need to sort through to be able to get back to commonality. Adding a little context on the process. As I mentioned, since we formed the Social Media Measurement Standards Coalition, AMEC, and the groups represented here, the Council of Public Relations Firms, Institute for PR, PRSA, and Global Alliance have formed a broader coalition for public relations research standards. And a lot of what they're looking to do builds upon what we're driving here in the Social Media Measurement Standards effort. And as part of that, I think we've started to come around to somewhat of a process for standards and how the guidelines that will be behind the standards. You see some of the guidelines here that the intent is that they really will be market-driven. They won't be deemed by any one company or any one individual or one association or even by us per se as the social media measurement standards groups. There is a process that we need to go through. There are standard processes for developing standards. The International Standards Organization has a lot of good things that we can leverage that are being plugged into this, and I believe the Institute for PR is actually applying for ISO certification. The intent is to get broad industry input, have this be something that promotes fair competition and obviously is compliant with antitrust laws. The way that the process really, I think, ultimately plays out is kind of 4 steps. There's a working group development effort, and I think that's really what we've been going through over the past 6 or 7 or 8 months through a variety of in-person meetings, conference calls, email exchanges, and other collaboration. That then leads to some sort of discussion guide that can be published and seek input around. And then that leads to development of an interim standard, the first of which we will introduce to you in a few minutes. And then that interim standard goes through a process of review and certification and actually adoption by some, critically through clients, and some testing to be able to then get to the place where it can become an approved standard. So it's a somewhat defined process. It feels somewhat loose as we go through it, but there is a method to the madness. I think one of the significant things that came out of the first conclave session was a development of key priorities for standardization, which we have evolved a bit in subsequent meetings. So these are the 6 key areas that we've identified. Content sourcing and methods basically means that there are a lot of things that relate to monitoring and methods that really are fundamental to this, and we've made a lot of progress on that. We have some progress, we've made progress and have more coming soon on reach and impressions as well as engagement. And then moving beyond that, getting into some of the qualitative factors of influence and relevance and opinion and advocacy, and then ultimately impact and value. So to the first standard, interim standard that we'll be unveiling, a little bit of background on the content sourcing and methods front. Ultimately, the challenge that we all find is getting to the right data is hard. And if you look at all of the different tools we use, the different resourcing or sourcing methodologies, that they're not created equal. And for clients in particular, this becomes a challenge because they could get a report from one vendor in this room and another vendor in this room and another agency, and they might want to compare those, they might want to bring those together in some way, but there's no way to really know how to bring them together because we're not being as transparent as we need to be in the content, the way we're sourcing content and the methods involved. And I think this is ultimately twofold. One is that we ultimately in this space have to use a lot of third-party tools or tools that companies in this room have developed, and we need to be more transparent about what's in those tools, but also the process that we're using from an analytics perspective or a research perspective to bring those together. So the solution that we've come up with is to develop essentially, many of you have seen, it's different organizations around the world, but nutrition tables or labels that exist on a lot of food products that basically tell you what's in the product. So I think this idea was sparked last year in Lisbon and seemed to have some good energy around it. So we've invested time over the past year to develop, okay, what would that nutrition table look like for what's in a social media measurement report? And without any further ado, here's the excitingly named Sources and Methods Transparency Table that we came up with. No, we won't use an acronym for this. So this is the blank version. We'll show you a completed, filled out version in a second. But basically, there are a number of categories here that you can see that are essentially designed to be blank fields to fill in. So you would fill in, some of this is standard methodology that we already include in a lot of reports already. But what is the time frame analyzed? Making that clear. Who the research lead is, so that there's some kind of accountability on either personal or organizational level. The channels analyzed, that is often very confusing for a lot of clients. Which channel, social media, well, what channels did you actually track in social media and what's included in the report? Getting into the data and content sources that you use to be able to get that data. And then the analysis depth. There's clearly a mix of automated and manual approaches. And there's also a level of depth that people go through, whether you're reviewing all of the content or some sort of representative sample. So being able to make that clear. Source languages and search languages are another area that we believe are important to be more transparent about. We've got a special section in here for sentiment coding, where at least there are a couple different checkbox possibilities, and there's certainly a lot more behind sentiment coding than just what would fit in these checkboxes, but these at least would create some comparability for clients to know, oh, well, am I comparing a report that was purely based on automated sentiment versus one that's based on manual sentiment? I think the other thing that this transparency table starts to do is it gets clients asking the right questions of what's in the data and starts to, I think, open up the types of discussion that we want to have with them on methodologies. Not that they have to become experts on the methodologies, but they do have to be aware of some of the differences in what the data is when they get that. There's been actually a decent amount of discussion about spam and bot filtering here, so that becomes a critical issue as you deal with the social media data. Actually, the formatting got goofed up a little bit there, but then we have some blank space to be able to share at least the top line on how you're calculating and what the sources are for reach, engagement, influence. This could change to social capital down the road, opinion and advocacy. And then the last two items are to kind of explain or at least call out any proprietary methods that you're using. Not that you have to necessarily go in and make and detail the algorithms behind it, but at least say, okay, we've got 3 different proprietary methods in this report, so that's called out. And then at the end, also to be able to expose the search strings, which you can't really do in this table, but for a client, going back to the Barcelona principle of transparency, for a report or research to be replicable by the client or replicable by somebody else, we need to be much more consistent in sharing the search strings that were used behind it, so the keywords are known and the strings are known so that they can be applied consistently. So that is essentially the table. Here is the work that Richard did on this report from January 1st through June 30th. Actually, that's bad because you're forecasting a few days. Mm-hmm. But here's an example of how it would be completed by an analyst or by a firm in a report that they're doing. We'll kind of leave this here. Some of these are checkboxes, and there is one little trick to this that I think we've run into a technical challenge where there's no way to create a table and have it be a form that where you can have like the left side of this be not editable and have the right side be editable. So if anybody has any solution to that one, Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, which we're presuming are going to be the typical way this would be delivered, don't offer that way to be able to do it. You can do it as a PDF document, but then you can't insert it into the document well. So we basically created it as a table. Don't edit the left side. So, Katie, do you want to talk about one of your favorite topics, reach and impressions?
Yes, and I think this is really gets to what people think of as standards, and it's really scary when you leave this room and you go out into the real world and you realize what people are talking about in terms of reach and impressions. The concept of multipliers has been widely discredited by the IPR and Barcelona principles and everything else, and yet people are still using them. Where that gets to be particularly challenging is if you do not have a transparent, accurate way of looking at impressions in the first place. So we recently analyzed were called in to fix a report which every single Facebook mention was credited with 900 million impressions times 3. And they wondered why, the client wondered, and here's the message to all of us in this room and all of your clients out in the room, is the fact that the agency doing the work, which has been represented here, the research firm didn't catch it, the agency didn't catch it. It wasn't until it got to the CMO who said, I really don't think that 300 billion people saw my messages this year. So if you want to be in that situation of having the client question your data, you can ignore this at your peril. However, the idea with reach and frequency is accuracy and realism about what is really going on there. The New York Times.blogs.com is not the same as the New York Times.blogs.com/food, right? There are different circulation figures, impression figures. So there's a huge amount of confusion about this, and in fact, not only should multipliers not be used, but there's a building body of research that says, first of all, only 10% that's out there gets seen, and second of all, of that 10%, only about 10% of that actually gets seen. I mean, how many people read every single thing that comes into your Twitter feed, right? Or your Facebook feed? It's probably a very small number. And we are working towards figuring out not what the multiplier is, but what the divider is. And we're going to start seeing much more realistic and accurate numbers, and that's where we're going with this. Now, the Media Ratings Council is going to have a much bigger role to play in some of this stuff because this is what they've been doing for 50 years. But the whole notion of taking numbers randomly so that they get bigger and multiplying them so they get even bigger, that practice is over, and especially in social media. So as I said, we're gonna rely a lot on the Media Ratings Council. They have a formal process for doing this stuff, but we are going to be tackling this particular thing next.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that's worth noting that's implied by the Media Ratings Council connection is this is an area where we have to have the same numbers as advertising.
Right.
We should not be using different numbers than advertising for the same media outlet. The trick is if you read all of the work that's been done in the advertising industry, they're struggling with this too because audience counts in digital are challenging. There are technical issues behind it that are frankly mind-numbing about who actually sees what they see. And then in social media channels, you have technical issues there too, where the algorithm that Facebook uses doesn't actually show you all of the posts for things that you follow. If you engage with that brand a lot, or if you engage with that person a lot, you will see more and more of those posts. So depending on the research, it's either 8 or 10% of people actually see the Facebook post that you thought. So if you're Coca-Cola and you have, 20 million followers, 20 million people are not seeing that post. There's less than 8 to 10% who will actually even get it in their Facebook stream, let alone actually read it. So there are important technical issues, I think, behind this that become important that we work through.
And the other huge issue here is that there's a big discussion, which is very quickly getting solved, but between unique daily visits, unique monthly visits, and all of those things in between that people have been debating about for a long time. And actually, the IAB came out with, unique browsers, not unique people. Big confusion out there, but basically it's all coalescing around the idea that if you want to be tracking these things, it's unique monthly visits divided by 30 is the standard that the IPR has just established. But in fact, if you're doing unique dailies and you multiply that times 30, you get a completely different number. So those standards we're coalescing around them, and we hope to have them by September.
Yeah. The next topic, engagement. There's been a lot of discussion about that here. Our preliminary guidance on engagement, and there's been a lot more discussion and probably even some more consensus around engagement than what's captured in this slide. But I think what our intent is with any of these other areas is to share some preliminary guidance here, let you know what our roadmap is in terms of the next action. Part of the next action for each of these is to be able to roll these out at other conferences for coalition member companies or conclave member companies. So on the engagement front, I think the place that actually was a pretty healthy debate about, well, what actually is engagement and where does engagement take over from something else? Ultimately, I think we got to the point where engagement is an action beyond the consumption itself, or something that happens after reach. So if you view something, that really falls into kind of the reach and impressions category. If you actually do something beyond that consumption or beyond that view, that is engagement. It's very blurry in terms of the way that people have been talking about engagement to date, but I think that became an important point in terms of how we define engagement and how we start to think about the metrics around engagement. The second area of debate was, okay, was engagement an outcome? And I think ultimately we concluded, yeah, it could be an outcome. It isn't necessarily the outcome. And it depends a lot, and I think this goes back to Philip's point, it depends on what the program is and what the organization's goals are and what you're trying to accomplish, whether it is an outcome or whether it's something on the path to an outcome.
And if I may say, the one thing that everybody in this room needs to leave here with is engagement, in fact, has two sides to it. One is a person engaged with your content, right? So how often do they come back, and all of those frequency metrics of, I go back to the page 3 times a month or once a month or whatever, which is something that Eric Peterson started talking about 3 or 4 years ago, and we've been using as an engagement metric for a while. But you've got to keep in your mind, there are people that are engaged and there are posts that are engaging. And it's two different parameters, and when you put them on a chart, they have to be two different things. And if you were in our UNICEF discussion yesterday, it's a very important distinction because you can't really mix them in the same sentence. You have to be aware that one thing is you're measuring posts to see whether they're engaging or not, or the content is engaging. The other one is, have you actually engaged an individual?
The other thing that's become clear is that there are different levels of engagement, and I think all of us who have been measuring engagement run into this challenge. And the place that we've gotten to so far is really that there are 3, and it may be arbitrary to come up with 3, but there's kind of a low, medium, and high level of engagement. And what we did here, just to give you some examples of by channel, what some of those might be in terms of low, medium, and high engagement. But it ultimately depends on the effort required, the inclusion of opinions, so are you just, passing something along or retweeting? Retweeting doesn't necessarily mean you're endorsing it or that you agree with the opinion, it's just you're sharing it. So that's something that's a little bit different than saying, oh yeah, this is great, and then sharing it. And how it's shared with others. So if you're sharing it with others, it has some sort of, it implies a higher level of engagement than if you're just posting or commenting on a post. Ultimately, as you look at, with a low example would be a Facebook like. Really easy to do. Doesn't necessarily imply a whole lot in terms of the opinion per se, even though it's called a like. And doesn't necessarily have as much of an impact on how you're sharing with others, as opposed to higher up the chain if you're creating an original video and sending that out to your friends in response to something. That concept of low, medium, and high, I think, is something that we've been looking at across the standard spectrum here. So as we start to publish our discussion documents later this summer or in the fall and through into next year, I think some of those concepts will become a little bit clearer, and our intent is to push that a little bit farther to be able to give even more guidance around what that would be. Philip's already talked quite a bit about influence and relevance. I think this is where ultimately, actually, on this first point, we probably still have some continuing debate as to whether influence leads to engagement or engagement leads to influence. But that's probably a separate discussion for another day. We have Philip's quote here, but I think some of the things that carry forward from our prior discussions is influence is absolutely multi-level and multidimensional. It's online and offline. The notion that you can have an influence score that characterizes your total influence and it's purely an online number doesn't make any sense. You've got people who are very influential who have no online presence who have a clout score of 0. I believe Warren Buffett still has a clout score of 0, even though he's fairly influential. And at the end, I think we ultimately believe in the notion of influence, and I think we'll be publishing things to that effect. And I think it gets to a lot of what Philip has shared here. But it is not a single score. It shouldn't be based purely on automated algorithms, and I think even some of the vendors in this space would agree that there's a lot of value and power to the analysts and what they're putting into it and how they're analyzing it. So certain tools, I think, are still absolutely valid in this. It's just it doesn't come down to a single score, and I think ultimately it gets down to the complexity of the system of influence that Philip talked about. Hand back over to Katie for opinion and advocacy.
Yeah, this is the one that generates probably the most amount of sentiment, which is that we're not going to come out and say, human versus automated or anything else. The idea is the fact that we will come out with some standard definitions and categories. But the idea is the fact that sentiment alone is not advocacy. It's what we're going to look at here is the expression of opinion and the definitions of advocacy. So we're not going to, the IPR traditional media measurement standards that were published last week, that addresses the issue of sentiment. It defines a standard of sentiment for traditional media. We're not going to do that because in social media, it is not about the, sentiment per se. It is about the opinion and the advocacy expressed. That's the road that we're going to go down. When you look at the conclave and the coalition and the broad number of groups involved, it just doesn't, as I keep saying, nobody says I'm in love with my spectrum technology. There's just a tremendous amount of social media. Everybody says, 80% of it is neutral. Well, the reason why 80% of it is neutral is a huge percentage of conversation out there is going on about business-to-business things that people aren't passionate about. It's not about movies. It's not about food. It's not about all those things that people are talking about. People talk about everything that happens in their life, and some of it is business, and some of it is life, and there's an awful lot of stuff that doesn't involve sentiment at all. Yeah. So we're really going to stay away from the whole sentiment conversation. We're going to look into definitions for opinions, but most importantly, we're also going to try and address the issue of advocacy and what constitutes advocacy. And one thing we didn't talk about in terms of engagement, but we can come up with a standard for engagement, but remember that there is going to be favorable, unfavorable, desirable, or undesirable levels of engagement. People were very, very engaged about the Susan G. Komen issue, perhaps not in a way that Susan G. Komen would have liked. So there are elements to this stuff that we're going to be addressing, and that's the third pillar, I guess, if you will, that we will be talking about in terms of these standards.
And last but not least, impact and value, and this has been another area of healthy discussion, and I think this one in particular speaks to Philip's point that ultimately impact and value depend on the client organization and objectives and a lot of other dynamics that are unique. I don't think our intent here is to say, okay, well, this is the standard or single metric that every client should use. The intent is to ultimately have a framework, have a set of metrics that could be standardized, and have them apply uniquely to the individual organization or campaign. I think there was good discussion yesterday about the ROI concept, and ultimately, I think where we've come down through a number of discussions is that ROI should be strictly limited, the use of the term ROI should be strictly limited to measurable financial impact, and some of us have advocated, and I think will contribute to this discussion, that total value as a notion can be used for including the financial and non-financial impacts. Richard has brought the balanced scorecard notion from business, essentially, acumen, as something that could be used in here as a way to look at financial and non-financial impacts. Obviously, value can be calculated in positive, defined positive returns of sales or reputation, or avoided negative returns, risk mitigated or cost avoided. Ultimately, I think KPIs, business scorecards, there's a lot of business language or business tools that become important in this, and so being able to frame our metrics or frame the impact and value in those business standard business tools becomes ultimately really critical. And I think, just given the nature and the flow of all of the things that we have mapped out here, this is probably the one that will push into 2013 before we have something published on that. So,
and this goes back to the confusion about standards. Very, very, very many of the clients that I talk to want a standard that translates into a dollar value. They want the, social media AV. If I hear it one more time, I may not live until 2013. But the notion is the fact that we've got to get this notion of value and the notion of a standard definition of value out of our clients' heads, because it's something that people in advertising are used to talking about, because you had GRPs and whatever they had. The reality is, in social media, it's not necessarily even a quantitative value number at all. It may be, again, cost avoided. It may simply be too many clients are out there going, well, we just need to get our feet wet in social media. Well, how do you measure wet feet? It doesn't translate. So this is the area where we anticipate the greatest amount of confusion.
Yeah, I would say the standard here in a lot of ways should be hire an analyst and do the work.
Yeah.
So recapping where we are, we believe we've made a lot of progress. I think the contributions of a lot of people in this room and a lot of people outside of this room have been incredibly valuable. This is essentially a part-time effort for everybody involved. It's been tremendously appreciated for what everybody's contributed to it. I think everybody's gone into it with the right spirit and has delivered a lot of value into it. I think the other question that comes up is, how can you get involved? And I think there are a couple different ways. We will actually be launching, it's a blog, smmstandards.org at some point next week that can share the materials from here, which will also be shared through AMAC and IPR and the coalition member companies. But we'll be able to also have a central site for at least SMM standards, and we're also trying to obviously push the hashtag SMM standards as well, to be able to create a kind of a unifying place to be able to share all of this information. So keep tabs on that, provide regular feedback on what's being published. We really encourage you to use the standards, the sources and methods transparency table in all of your reports, and I think also as you do that, give us feedback. We'll all collectively learn from applying it in our own reports and in our own systems. Our intent by the fall is to be able to go into hopefully the PRSA conference in October in San Francisco and be able to share an update on specific agencies and research firms and clients who have tried it, had it work for them, and they've adopted it and embraced it as standard in their reports. Share the updates with clients and discuss this live. Ultimately, to me, the standardization process is an opportunity for all of us to have the right discussions with clients on what's changing and what they need to be thinking about. I haven't met a client yet who doesn't want to know about next practices and what's coming around the corner. So this is not only a thought leadership opportunity for us in rooms like this, but really a consultative opportunity for us with clients. So that's I think the conclusion of the remarks, and we'll hand it back to Richard for a few questions or
Great.
not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm conscious that I've got water and Katie and Tim have got water, but you guys probably haven't, and very keen for a coffee. So we have got 5 minutes for questions. So who would like to ask the first question? We've got one from Evgeny. So.
Evgeny Ex-Libris. I actually have specific questions about sentiment and engagement. First, with example with engagement. If somebody who just read the post, he go and register without sharing any information, what level will you give to this action?
Register.
Just register on the site or buy something from the site, but without sharing the.
Anybody who gives you their identity and becomes part of your marketable universe, that counts as somebody who's engaged, because even though they don't share, they've given their identity to you to market to further.
Yeah. So signing up at a site is
That's
engagement.
actually fairly high
Downloading
level,
a white
depending
paper
on the
is
goals,
engagement.
but fairly high level.
Buying
Okay.
something is engagement.
And just one remark about sentiment. There were 4 different like opinion, recommendation, feelings, and intended action. But maybe it's a little bit too much, because intended action and the recommendation, it's almost the same, and as well as feelings and opinion, it's like.
There's probably a healthy debate. It's probably
Just
a whole other session to be able to cover that. But I would say there are distinctions between these. So opinion and recommendation are different. So you can say it's a good product, but that doesn't mean I'm telling, hey, Mike, you should buy it. That there's a level of, I think, force behind the opinion that starts to become different there.
Sorry, I mean that opinion and feelings are the same, and recommendation and intended action are the same. Because I'm going to buy it, this is a kind of recommendation, and buy it or try it, this is a recommendation. So they are actually the same.
Yeah, I think a recommendation in this case would be different than intended action, because a recommendation is I'm telling Mike to buy it. An intended action would be me saying on Twitter or Facebook or wherever that I'm going to buy it. So that becomes incredibly valuable. I think one of the things that is probably at least obvious to some of us who've been doing this, and I think 1 or 2 of the examples yesterday became clear, is that social media is a huge opportunity for understanding customer opinion, essentially doing market research in different ways. And I think there are things that clients are looking for to be able to filter social media as a way to get a much more real-time feedback loop than they've ever had from traditional survey research or other types of market research. So there are nuances and important things that clients are looking at from this data that we need to start to segment out more. And I think ultimately that's the point of that section, is that, okay, if all we're doing is providing sentiment, and that's our, the totality of our qualitative assessment of what we're reviewing, we're doing the industry a disservice. There's so much richer dimensions in all of the data that we're tracking. So how do we filter that out in ways? And those are 4 ways that we've kind of preliminarily identified, but there could be a lot more.
But I think we also really need to say here, remember the Barcelona principles. It's all about the goals. UNICEF doesn't get recommendations necessarily. That's not, you look at the nonprofits, you look at all the different types of PR programs there are out there, and there may or may not be classically defined positive or negative sentiment at all. And it may not be, that's why we called it opinion and advocacy, because essentially there may not be any tonality at all to the conversation that matters to the client. What matters to the client may simply be that something does or does not appear.
Okay, have we got another question? Right, on that basis, I'll just add actually one thing to it. With the transparency table there, we'd urge you to use it. We'll make it available on the AMEC website. It does come with a logo, which you can proudly display in your reports to your clients, saying that you're following an industry approved approach to transparency and moving towards standards. So I urge you please to use that and to give us the feedback. Please join me in thanking Katie and Tim very much.